Hey, how you doing? This is Tony Dubiel here from Cisco Cloud and Managed Services Organization. If you tuned into our previous video, I went through the Intercloud Fabric Director and the ability to use APIs to configure the functionality as well as to view the configurations and to migrate virtual machines, etc. In the other video, it was about 30 minutes, and there was some advanced capabilities that I thought justified having them in their own video, so we could spend a bit more time explaining the parameters and how to put this API call together properly. And that's what this video is. So today we're going to look at migrating a virtual machine, a live virtual machine as it exists in the private cloud to a public cloud provider, Azure, and then consequently migrating that workload in Azure back to the private cloud. If you recall, in the last video we went through the API calls and the variables and parameters that we can use, and for the most part those API calls were fairly simple. Today we're going to focus on migrating a virtual machine, which is a bit more complex in that we have several parameters that we need to address as we put this API call together. So if we look at moving a virtual machine to the cloud, that's what this one is, the user API move VM to cloud variable. As we input parameters, we have to account for the VM ID, so that's the number that is associated with a specific virtual machine. The string VM name, which is the actual name of the instance, the virtual machine instance. We also have to include the virtual data center that we would like to migrate the virtual machine into in the provider cloud, so we need to know the name of the virtual data center. We also have a string comment where we can leave that blank or add a comment, a description, into this virtual machine as we're migrating it. And then we have to include a value, a Boolean value, either true or false, to identify whether or not we'd like to remove the source configuration and VMDK file from the vCenter as we migrate it to the public cloud. We can leave it there in case we would like to clone that virtual machine or to have it as a safety net in case something fails for whatever reason, or we can delete it. In this case, moving to the public cloud, I usually leave it as is in the enterprise data center. However, when migrating back from the public cloud to the private cloud, I normally would delete that file, because if you don't delete, which means terminate the virtual machine in the public cloud provider, in some cases you would still accrue charges. So just powering down a virtual machine does not stop the infrastructure as a service metering usage fees that the public cloud provider would charge you. So normally I would go ahead and remove it to stop accruing those charges as they are. So what we'll do is we're going to take a look at that same tool that we did last time, which was the Postman. So the Postman is a Chrome tool. There's also a REST client that you can use in Firefox as well, or we could have used a curl script from a Mac operating system, or PowerShell from Windows, or create a Python script if we know how to program in Python. All of those options are available to communicate with the APIs in Intercloud Fabric Director. So what we did the last time is we need to add that key. So this is the key that gives us the privileges and the roles access level that we need in order to make a change in Intercloud Fabric Director. And again, this is based off of a user account. So this is a user account as it exists in my lab environment. And then we need to add those parameters and the rest of the API call. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this. So this is the IP address of the Intercloud Fabric Director. Every API call has this URL associated with it, the app API REST. And then the op name is where we would add the actual function that we need. So in this case it's Intercloud, and then it would be user API move VM to cloud, because we're migrating from private cloud to public cloud. And then the op data is where we add the parameters. So parameter 0 is 68, which happens to be the identifier of that virtual machine that already is live and running in the Intercloud Fabric Director, and we'll take a quick look at that before we migrate it. And then parameter 1 is the virtual machine name, Azure QA. And then parameter 2 is the virtual data center ID, which is 17. The Azure QA VDC is mapped to 17. And then parameter 3 is a comment, a description. So I just put a placeholder in here that we're migrating. And then parameter 4 was that Boolean variable, either true or false, depending on if we wanted to delete the configuration file and virtual disk from the vCenter and from that virtual machine host, or leave it alone in case we wanted to do something with it later. So I'm going to go ahead and use false, which will go ahead and leave that file as it is stored on the data store of the virtual vCenter. Okay, so before we launch this, I wanted to show you what we have in the system. This is the admin console. If you recall from the previous video, we looked at API calls, primarily using the postman to look at the status of the virtual machines and powering on and off, and etc. What I wanted to do this time was just to give you some perspective of what we've seen in the past in the GUI, and then connect some of the dots of what's going to happen from configuring and requesting to migrate a virtual machine from the API call. So this Azure QA is up and running in my vCenter, right? It's powered on, it's up and running. It has an IP address associated with it. That IP address is, hold on a second, is 192.168.2.5. So it is up and running, and it's in our data center, and I can show you that from the vCenter itself. It's this one right here, Azure Q&A, and it's running in this VMware host that's managed by this vCenter. Okay. Okay, so I realize I need to to change a few parameters here. There's a few typos, so just to run through that real quick. All right, so parameter 0 is the VM identifier. Parameter 1 is the name of the virtual machine instance. Parameter 2 is the name of the virtual data center to VDC. It's not the actual number associated with it, so it's the name. Parameter 3 is just a comment, so I just put comment for now. And parameter 4 is true or false, depending on if we want to delete the configuration file and virtual disk files. Okay, so we have a problem here with the ID of 68, so let's see what we have here. Okay, so we're going to use the get all VMs so we can see what VMs we actually have. I'll scroll down. Aha. It changed to 69. We need 69 in here. Scroll across. 69. And let's make sure we have our other parameters. Azure QA, comment, and false. Drum roll, please. All right. So there we go. We have a service result number of 91. And I'm going to go ahead and go into Intercloud Director and look at the service request. And then we have a 91. So let's check here for details. Verbose details. Okay, so it's going through the process, and we will come back here in a second and see what our status is. Looky there, we're starting to get a little bit closer. We've got about 2 gigs out of the 3 gigs, and it's on its way to being migrate it to Azure. In Azure, we find that the Azure QA virtual machine is starting to provision and power on. So we obviously are getting closer to completing the migration. Meanwhile, back at Intercloud Fabric Director, we have completed the migration, as it were, and we can go ahead and look at it to make sure that the status is available. We'll go over to the cloud, the compute. Look at the VMs. Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead and organize by the cloud. So we can see in Azure we have Azure Q&A. Here's the private IP address. It is up and running. Go ahead and give it a ping. All right. Now let's go the other way. Let's migrate it back using an API call. As you might imagine, every time that we migrate the virtual machine to or from the cloud, the VM identifier will increment each time. So taking a look at get all VMs, we can see that at this point in time, the Azure Q&A, as it is residing in Azure, has increased by 1 digit to 70 from 69 to 70. So we'll need to add that to our API call, obviously. Let's start here by changing the variable, and then we'll adjust the parameters. All right, so we're not moving to the cloud, we're moving the other direction. So we change that from VM, from the cloud to enterprise. Scroll back so you can see that. API move VM to enterprise. This first parameter needs to be a 70. That is the name of the VM, which at this point in time has not changed. This is different because we are moving to a different VDC. So if we take a look here at the parameters, when we are moving back here, these are the parameters. So we've got the ID, the VM name, the target VDC, which is now different. So if we take a look at that, we go back into our policies, our virtual data centers, right? And then we have our private data centers here. So we're going to want to copy this one. Okay, let's look at our parameters one more time before we send this in. We have 7 parameters here. So parameter 0 is 70 is the VM ID. The name of the VM instance is Azure QA. Parameter 2 is the VDC that we're moving to in our private cloud, so it's a private VDC. We need the address of the VM host. We need the data store name, a comment section, and then true to remove the configuration files and virtual disk from Azure. Okay, so now we have a service result of 92. Again, we can check the status as it migrates from Azure back to the private cloud. Go back to out of here altogether. 91. So 91 is actually that's old. Let's refresh that. 92. 92 is our service request ID. It is in progress. And let's look at the verbose entries in the log. And we are in the process of powering off the VM on the Azure side of things, which is right here. again. So it's still running, which means that it's still in the process of making API calls and whatnot. At this point in time, it is now stopped in Azure. And as we take a look at it in Intercloud Fabric Director, we are starting to transfer the virtual machine back to the private data center. So this will take a few minutes or so. Okay, we're getting close here. As we look in our vCenter that exists in the private data center, we can see that we have Azure QA that is powered on now, and we can see the actual Linux login screen. We'll go ahead and jump back into our status and see where we're at with Intercloud Fabric. And here we are towards the end. We'll check availability. It's refreshing the inventory. It should be deleting or terminating the Azure QA instance in Azure, so we need to check that as well. So this is about done. Let's go ahead and toggle into Azure and refresh the screens. It's gone now. It no longer exists. The Azure QA no longer exists in Azure. So one last look here in the status, and we can see that it has completed. And if we take a look here, we'll see that it is now a part of the private data center Q&A virtual data center that we set up for migrating back to the data center, on-premise data center. So let's go to the VMs summary. Oh, I'm sorry, keep doing that. VMs, cloud, and if we look into the vCenter, we see that we have Azure QA in our private QA virtual data center. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention for this advanced API video demonstration on migrating to the public cloud and migrating back from the public to the private cloud using the API calls. I look forward to seeing you on our next video and demonstration, which will be a deeper dive into some of the more advanced application delivery topics, such as Docker containers, as well as other tool sets that we can use as part of application lifecycle management on top of Intercloud Fabric Director and Business Edition, using tool sets like Ansible and others to manage the virtual machine applications that reside in this multi-cloud configuration. So I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take care.